Working the graveyard shift at a convenience store wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. Most nights, I actually enjoyed the solitude. Just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional customer wandering in from the endless stretch of highway outside. The store itself felt like an island, a small fluorescent cube glowing in the middle of a sea of darkness. There wasn't much else around except the empty parking lot and the hum of crickets outside, which somehow felt louder at 2 a.m. It was the kind of job where the worst thing you expected was running out of coffee during a late rush. At least, that's what I thought at first. But over time, something about those long, silent nights started to get to me. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far under the flickering lights, or how the occasional creak of the building felt louder than it should have. Sometimes, I'd catch myself glancing at the security monitors, almost hoping to see something, anything, moving, just to remind myself I wasn't completely alone. The feeling wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was more like being watched, though there was never anyone there. Or so I thought. It was around my third week on the job when the first strange customer came in. She looked normal enough, middle-aged, wearing a coat despite the warm night. But something about her felt off. She walked down the aisles like she didn't really know what she was looking for, pausing for far too long in front of items like canned beans and cleaning supplies. When she finally brought a pack of gum to the counter, she avoided my eyes, staring at the register instead. Her voice was flat when she spoke, like she was trying too hard to sound casual. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she was just shy, I figured. But then, as she handed me her cash, her fingers brushed mine, and they were ice cold, like she'd been holding onto a block of ice before coming in. The next one was worse. A man pulled up in a beat-up sedan around 3 a.m. and stood at the gas pump for what felt like ages before finally coming inside. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and when he reached the counter, he looked me straight in the eye. His pupils were weirdly dilated, almost swallowing the color in his irises, and his smile was wrong, like he didn't know how to use the muscles in his face. "Do you have souls in cans?" he asked, dead serious. "Or maybe bottled silence?" I thought it was some kind of weird joke, but his expression didn't change. When I told him no, he nodded once, stiffly, and walked out without another word. After that, I started paying closer attention to the customers. Most were normal, or at least as normal as people wandering into a convenience store at 4 a.m. can be. But every so often, there was one who didn't fit. They didn't always look strange, but there was something in their behavior that set me on edge. Like the guy who stood in front of the refrigerator section for 10 minutes, staring at a single bottle of soda without blinking, or the woman who walked in barefoot, her feet leaving no marks on the floor even though it had been raining outside. These things stuck with me, but I shrugged them off, until the night the cameras started acting up. It was a slow shift, and I was killing time by watching the monitors. Usually they were boring, just empty aisles and a grainy view of the parking lot. But that night, one of the cameras glitched. It flickered for a second, and when the feed came back, the angle was wrong. It was showing a view of the counter, but we didn't have a camera pointed there. At first, I thought maybe the system was just old, but when I rewound the footage, my stomach dropped. The recording showed me standing behind the counter, but there was something else. A figure was standing at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by a shelf. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall, unnaturally still, and I didn't remember anyone being in the store at that time. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it had to be some kind of glitch, but the unease lingered. Later that same night, while I was restocking shelves in the back, I heard the faint ding of the front door opening. That wasn't unusual. What was strange was that no one called out or came into view. I waited for a moment, expecting the sound of footsteps or the creak of the aisles. Nothing. When I peeked around the corner, the store was completely empty. The door was shut, and the parking lot was just as desolate as before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Things escalated after that. A couple of nights later, I had another encounter that left me genuinely rattled. The customer was a man in a dark suit, his outfit oddly old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. He didn't say much, just asked for a coffee. But the way he stood, perfectly still, staring straight ahead as I prepared his drink, made my skin crawl. When I placed the cup on the counter, he didn't move to pick it up. I looked up, and for the first time, I noticed his face. It wasn't right. His skin looked too smooth, almost plastic, and his eyes, they didn't seem real. I blinked, and he was gone. Just like that. The coffee was still steaming on the counter, untouched. I couldn't shake the incident with the man in the suit. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. A few nights later, something even stranger happened. The security cameras had been acting up more frequently, flickering, cutting to static, or showing angles that didn't exist. That night, while reviewing the footage from my break, I noticed something chilling. There were customers on the tapes, people I didn't remember serving. They walked in, browsed the aisles, even stood at the counter while I rang them up. The problem was I had no memory of them being there, and in some clips, they didn't cast shadows. One clip stood out in particular. It showed a woman in a long coat, standing by the refrigerators. Her face was turned away from the camera, but something about her posture seemed wrong, stiff and unnatural. Suddenly, she turned her head, as if she knew she was being watched. Even though the footage was black and white, her eyes stood out, wide and glinting like mirrors. She stared directly at the camera for what felt like an eternity before walking out of frame. I stopped watching after that. After that, I started to dread coming into work. The store felt different, like it was alive, watching me just as closely as I watched it. One night, during a heavy storm, the power flickered and went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, and all I could hear was the pounding rain against the windows and the faint hum of the emergency lights kicking in. I was standing behind the counter, frozen, when I noticed movement outside. The parking lot, which had been empty all night, was now filled with silhouettes. Dozens of them, standing completely still, all facing the store. My stomach sank, and my first instinct was to grab the phone and call someone, anyone, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. As I stood there, clutching the useless receiver, the lights flickered back on. I ran to the window, but the parking lot was empty again. No cars, no people, just puddles reflecting the neon glow of the store sign. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had the darkness played tricks on me? Or were they real? Either way, I knew I wasn't imagining the unease settling into my chest like a weight. The last straw came a few nights later. It was around 4 a.m., and the store had been dead quiet for hours. I was counting the cash drawer when I heard the faint chime of the automatic door opening. I looked up, expecting to see a late-night traveler or maybe a trucker. Instead, a woman walked in slowly, almost gliding, and stopped a few feet from the counter. She was pale, unnaturally so, and her hair was soaked, dripping onto the floor even though it hadn't rained that night. Her clothes were dry, though, and that detail stuck with me. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't normal. It was layered, like several voices talking in unison, some deep, some high-pitched, all slightly out of sync. "Do you know what you're selling here?" she asked, her eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The question didn't even make sense, yet it felt heavy, like it meant something I couldn't grasp. Before I could gather myself, she smiled, an empty, hollow kind of smile, and turned around. She walked out the door, but when I rushed to the window to see where she went, the parking lot was completely empty. I didn't even bother trying to finish my shift after that. I shut the register, grabbed my jacket, and went outside to smoke, hoping the cold air might help clear my head. As I stood there, the world felt eerily still. No cars, no sounds, not even the chirping of crickets. The only noise was the faint hum of the store's neon sign. That's when I noticed it, movement on the edge of the parking lot. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows like they'd been waiting for me to step outside. They didn't walk normally. Their movements were jerky, almost glitchy, like they were skipping frames in a video. They stayed just at the edge of the light, circling the store silently. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't just moving randomly. They were forming a ring around the building. I dropped my cigarette and bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the key. When I turned around, the store was dark again, even though the power had been fine moments ago. I stayed behind the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. The figures outside didn't try to get in, but I could feel them. Even with the doors locked and the blinds drawn, I felt exposed, like they could see me no matter where I went. My eyes darted to the security monitors, hoping they might give me some clue about what was happening. At first, the screens showed nothing but static, but then, one by one, the cameras came back online. The parking lot was empty again, no figures, no movement. But something about the footage wasn't right. The timestamp on the monitor was wrong. It was hours behind, showing events I hadn't witnessed yet. In one feed, I saw myself standing at the counter, but the version of me on the screen wasn't moving. He, Or I was just standing there, staring directly into the camera with a blank expression. I looked down at myself, half expecting to feel someone else's gaze, but the store was still empty. When I looked back at the screen, the version of me behind the counter was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the manager, but as usual, it went straight to voicemail. I didn't even bother leaving a message. Instead, I decided to leave the store altogether, at least until the sun came up. But as I reached the door, the automatic mechanism refused to open. I tried pushing, pulling, even hitting the emergency release button, but it was like the door was frozen in place. That's when I noticed something outside. In the reflection of the glass, I saw a figure standing directly behind me. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to come face to face with whatever had been tormenting me all night. But there was no one there. Just the store, empty and quiet as ever. My reflection in the glass, however, didn't move when I did. It stood there, staring at me with that same blank expression I'd seen on the security monitor. And then it smiled, just a slight twitch of the mouth, but it was enough to make my knees buckle. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rack of candy bars as I tried to put as much distance as I could between myself and the door. My reflection in the glass was still there, smiling faintly, but now it was moving, stepping forward, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass like it was trapped on the other side. The smile widened, stretching unnaturally across its face. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, and then just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. My reflection was normal again, mirroring my pale, trembling face. I didn't dare move closer to the door. Instead, I backed away slowly, retreating to the counter where I could keep an eye on both the monitors and the entrance. That's when I saw it. On the counter was a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, revealing a single, handwritten sentence. "You're on the right side for now." By the time the sun started to rise, I felt like I'd been awake for days. The pale light of dawn seeped through the windows, washing over the store and making everything feel almost normal again. But I wasn't fooled. I finished my shift in a daze, refusing to look at the security monitors or the windows. I just stared at the clock, counting down the seconds until my relief came in. When the morning guy finally showed up, I didn't say a word about what had happened. He gave me a strange look when I practically ran out the door. Over the next few days, I tried to quit. I didn't care about the paycheck, I just wanted out. But when I called the number for the manager, no one picked up. I even drove by during the day, hoping to talk to someone in person, but the place was locked up, the lot empty. I asked around and found out something that still chills me. Nobody seemed to know who owned the store. It was like it existed in its own bubble, completely disconnected from the world. I eventually gave up trying to make sense of it. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about that note on the counter and the reflection that wasn't mine.